Paul Levinson. Welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here, Jed.
So I started looking through your biography online in preparation for the podcast, of course. And of course, I bumped into the first thing was professor at Fordham University in New York City. And then it went to author, and then it went to novelist, and then singer-songwriter. And I realized I was well out of my depth here. So I might hand the reins to you to introduce yourself and this wonderful eclectic background that you have.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I guess the explanation for this multivariant, eclectic list of accomplishments and backgrounds is I've always been a great believer in doing as much damage as possible, which for me is to anytime I really enjoy something, whether it's some kind of intellectual experience like reading Karl Popper's work, or it could be a science fiction novel, or it could be some music. I also have this instinct that comes right along with that to create something in that realm that I'm appreciating. And I guess it's a good thing I never had much love for nuclear physics. I probably would have blown the world up if I pursued that. But as I was growing up in the Bronx, not that far from where I am now in Westchester County, and actually not that far at all from Fordham University, where I currently teach. In fact, where I grew up, I could actually walk to Fordham University. But as I was growing up, the two things that I was really most excited by were indeed rock and roll music and science fiction. And then a little later on, when I got into high school and college, I became very interested in philosophy. And so ever since then, I've been working in all of those fields. And, it's not even limited by those general topics, because if you think about it, there's a lot of politics in science fiction. I don't mean there's politics, of course, in how you get a book published, but I mean in the story of the science fiction, there's politics. And apropos of Popper, it's impossible to read any philosophy and not try to use it to help make sense out of the world that we are now living in. So, and it's always been that way, although I guess things have gotten somewhat worse. But the reason why I'm mentioning that is I've also dabbled in political science and written and spoken on topics that might more properly be called political science and political opinion than philosophy, or certainly science fiction.
So before we get into the content here, how did that background lead you to Popper specifically? And of course, to Bill Bartley as well.
Well, so here's exactly what happened. The first thing I tried to do in that bouquet of various and to me beautiful things was indeed to make some music. And I came out with an album in 1972 called Twice Upon a Rhyme. It didn't do very well back then. In fact, it pretty much disappeared and was later discovered in the late 1990s, rediscovered actually in Japan. And just to give you an idea of how devoted I am to what I do, I didn't come out with my second album until 2020. So first album, 1972, second album, 2020. I guess I was waiting for my audience to build up. But when I was somewhat disappointed with the reception that Twice Upon a Rhyme initially got, I decided to go back to school. And I had dropped out of City College to pursue music. I went back to school to NYU, and I discovered that I really enjoyed learning in that situation, higher education. And I in those days, I was majoring in communication and media studies at the undergraduate level. I went on to the New School for Social Research in Manhattan, got an MA in media studies, discovered Marshall McLuhan and his work. We can talk about that later. And within a year or two, I was back at NYU pursuing my PhD in what was then called the Media Ecology Program, which had nothing to do with the ecology of the earth. It was not biological ecology. It was really ecology of media in a metaphoric sense, that just as living organisms all interact with one another and one dominates the other, et cetera, so media do that among themselves. And this is where Karl Popper's work came in for me. And through that, as I was working on my doctoral dissertation, which you can still read it, it's now available in Kindle and not too expensive. It's called Human Replay, a theory of the evolution of media. And in that PhD dissertation, I came up with a theory I call the anthropotropic theory of media evolution. Anthropo meaning human, tropic meaning towards. For example, plants have a tropism towards light, meaning they grow towards light. And what I was saying in my doctoral dissertation and in this theory was that as media evolve, they grow closer and closer to human modes of communication. They continue to extend across space and time. That's the reason they were first invented. But initially, they do that in a very artificial way. If you think about it, the written word, nothing is like it in the natural environment. It's very artificial. But what we're now doing, talking essentially, even though you're in Korea and I'm here in New York, we can have this natural mode of conversation because media have evolved. Writing, of course, still exists because it does other beneficial things. It has what I call reliable locatability. But nonetheless, media have evolved so that you and I can have this conversation. In any case, in my doctoral dissertation, I was looking for anthropologists, philosophers, anyone I could get my hands on that had any relevance to the evolution of media. And it will come as no surprise to people who are already familiar with Popper. I came upon his book, Objective Knowledge, in which Popper talked about how ideas themselves evolve and how our knowledge has evolved. And I became very interested in evolutionary epistemology, which Donald T. Campbell had developed. He had a great essay in a book of essays about Popper. So before too long, I was finished with my dissertation. I passed my orals. And as I previously said, I'm the kind of person when I really love something as a consumer, I want to do it as well, produce it. And I realized as I was reading Popper that, in my opinion, at least, he was not getting the appreciation and audience that he deserved. I'd read many philosophers. Some were very well known, like Bertrand Russell or Immanuel Kant. Some weren't very well known. But by and large, I always thought that the ones who were really well known deserved that position. And I thought Popper deserved that position as well, except if you ask the average, let's just say, college student, it's probably the same way now, but let's say back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, who's Bertrand Russell? They probably could tell you. Certainly if you ask them who's Plato or Socrates, they could tell you. But if you ask them, well, who's Karl Popper? They have no idea who Karl Popper was. So I wanted to do something to change that. And I came up with the idea of publishing an anthology of essays on Karl Popper's philosophy. And again, what I just did is I read anything that I could that was written about Popper, and I came upon Joseph Agassi's work. I invited him into the anthology. Other people told me about people that I didn't know already, like Jeremy Sherma. And by the way, I was reading your page, and I see that both Jeremy Sherma and Joseph Agassi have been interviewed here on your podcast, so I'm honored to be among them. And that's how I came upon Bill Bartley. And I'm not quite sure where exactly I had read about him, but I remember I sent him, of course, this was before email. I sent him a letter and told him about the anthology that I was working on. And I really liked his reply, because as I was working on this anthology, I had heard from several people that there were several other anthologies that were beginning to be in the works. As a matter of fact, I think Jeremy Sherma was putting together, he had an anthology in the very initial phases. So in the letter I wrote Bartley, the first letter, he was out in California, I was here in New York. I said, look, is this a wise thing for me to do? I mean, I don't want there to be too many anthologies. I don't want to step on anyone's toes. And Bartley said, no, it's a very wise thing for you to do. You know, we need as many anthologies as possible. So that's how I first met Bartley. I, shortly after In Pursuit of Truth came out, organized a conference in New York. Bartley was at the conference. I'm sure Jeremy Sherman was at the conference. Popper was not at the conference. He was in relatively good physical shape, but didn't particularly want to even travel from London to New York. But we talked Friedrich Hayek into coming to the conference, so it was quite a good conference. And that's how Bartley and I got to know each other. And I consider him to this day one of the most insightful, well thought out, and certainly articulate philosophers I've had the benefit of knowing in my life.
That's a wonderful introduction to Bartley. I've been reading him the last 2 weeks in preparation for this, and I've been completely captivated by him as well. And I begin to realize a lot of the differences he had with Popper, which I ascribe to Popper, are actually Bartley, and are more in line with the way Bartley thinks. So on that, let's start. Who was Bartley? Because I have in front of me a chapter from that book of yours, In Pursuit of Truth. And Bartley talks about his own story at the beginning. I think he was the only American to come across in those early stable of people in Popper's circle at the LSE in London. And he writes early on, quite funnily in some ways, he writes, the only thing that his advisors told him about Popper was he's a difficult man and that he would regret going there. And yet he went there and he finds this an absolutely thrilling experience in some ways. So who was Bartley? And tell me about those early years, about how he got his way across to Popper.
So yes, obviously Bartley was an American. He actually became extremely interested in Popper's work when he was just on the verge of finishing his master's work and going on. That was his original intention, to become a minister in one of the Protestant religions. But something inside him rebelled against that. He was already rebelling against the authoritarian aspect of religion. And frankly, it always surprised me that he thought about becoming a minister in the first place. But he was immediately attracted to Popper because of Popper's critical attitude towards ideas, meaning that everything was open to criticism and should be criticized. And that's what drew Popper to London, and I'm sorry, that's what drew Bartley to London and to Popper in the first place. And once he got there, you know, he found himself in in one sense, an ideal world, because here he could learn from Popper directly and also meet all of Popper's students, Joseph Agassi, Ian Jarvie. All of these people were there as his students. Musgrave from your part of the world was there studying with Popper. But at the same time, he found an enormous amount of competition with them, because one of the things that Popper, who I met just, I think, twice in my life, and we didn't really have that much of a substantial conversation, but it certainly became clear to Bartley, and I'm sure all of his students, that on the one hand, what Popper was talking about was the absolute essential necessity of being critical about everything. But as a human being, understandably, Popper was not too happy with people who criticized his point of view. You had to accept Popper's critical rationality just the way that Popper presented it. And so Popper's leading students, sooner or later, wound up becoming at odds with Popper, mainly because they were daring to suggest things that maybe Popper wasn't 100% in their view being consistent with. And on that issue of rationality and being open to criticism, having read Popper's works very, very carefully, and certainly more thoroughly than even I read Popper's works, Bartley found places in which Popper was, in Bartley's view, and I agreed with Bartley on this, too open to accepting something without being sufficiently critical of it. And as you probably know, eventually what happened is there was something of a split, a schism between Bartley and Popper, in which Bartley developed this theory of pancritical rationalism, and the essential word there is pan, being critical to everything, including the very process of deciding upon critical rationalism. You can't, according to Bartley, make anything immune from the critical process. And this, by the way, is something that I think anyone who seriously considers this notion of being open to criticism all the time, this enigma, almost a paradox, and certainly something that's on the verge of infinite regress, it's something that any serious student of this philosophy, in one way or another, soon has to consider. I, for example, have long said that at the very, very basis of critical rationalism and even pancritical rationalism is an irrational acceptance of rationality. And what I mean by that is, if you are doubting that rationality works, let's say, you're some kind of COVID vaccine denier, and you're claiming that absurd things are happening. In order for you to get that person to be reasonable, you have to present a reasonable argument to that person. In other words, the only way you can defeat an argument or a position that irrationality doesn't work is to present a rational argument in which you are assuming the very result of what you're trying to convince this person of in your argument. By the way, I told that to Bartley, and he, thought that was interesting, but he was really no different from Popper. He didn't particularly like criticisms of his work. Again, this is human nature. So anyway, but to get back to what you were saying, at the time that I came to know Bartley, and in the development of In Pursuit of Truth as an anthology, and in the co-organization of that conference in 1982, in which we considered Popper's philosophy, Bartley was already somewhat at odds with Popper, but he still loved Popper. I mean, I think he always loved Popper, and he still had a connection to Popper that Bartley was very happy that he had. And anytime that connection was threatened or damaged, Bartley was always upset about that.
So, as you were talking, I was scribbling down little notes, and as you finished, I think perhaps we should go back just a step. It's so interesting, this pancritical rationalism, but I think I was reading a paper by Jarvie, and he said one of the most important things that Bartley did was properly rephrase and properly phrase, in that sense, what Popper's problem situation was through the traditions of rationalism, then critical rationalism, and then to Bartley's pancritical rationalism. So I might get you to start just at the very beginning here of what is rationalist? So people listening to this may think, well, I'm not really sure what the term is. It's one of those terms that gets used around a lot. So what is traditional rationalism? People often run this back to Kant and to sense experience and things like this.
Well, rationalism is, you can look at it in several different ways, and it all ultimately points to the same thing. You can look at it abstractly and say, I have two rocks here. I'm going to add two rocks to these first two rocks. I have four rocks. 2 + 2 = 4. So that's an intellectual point. And we think, and I think this is something that is a warranted thought, that unless you're a very, very young child, like maybe 1 year of age or younger, you will accept that 2 + 2 = 4. The reason why I'm just even hedging a little bit on that is, as I'm sure you know, Jean Piaget, the child psychologist, was one of the leaders in pointing out that if you take, let's say, a 2-year-old child and you have a tall, thin glass of water and pour it into a short, fat glass, the little child will insist that the short, fat glass has less water because they don't have that constancy of material. To them, tall is always going to be more than short, even though they see the same water being moved. But certainly as we develop and get a little older than being a little child, we develop that rational process. And that example, I think, is the basis of both understanding the physical world in a rational way, but also understanding rational arguments. To use, a very obvious example that our legal system relies on, as they should, if a person is accused of committing a crime and the defense can show that that person was not at the place that the crime was committed, well, if the district attorney, if the prosecutor knows that that's the case, even if the police know that that's the case, they shouldn't pursue, the case any further. And if they do pursue the case, and it comes to a jury, and the defense is able to come up with evidence that the accused person was just not there. And of course, what would that evidence be? Originally, it would be testimony. Now, maybe it would be video recordings. It would have to be video recordings that are certified as not being deep fakes. This assumes that there are people who can tell the difference between an expertly done deep fake, but all of that is just really specific circumstances. The point about rationality is on something as profound as, is this person guilty of committing this crime, including maybe even a murder? What rationality is understanding that you can't be in two places at the same time. This, by the way, is why science fiction is so interesting, because science fiction could make the person use some kind of teleportation device and get, from New York to Melbourne, instantly, do the crime and come back to New York. And that's one of the things that's fun about science fiction. But we don't yet have that technology. So rationality in law would lead us to conclude, and how could it not, that a person who is not in the physical place where a crime took place did not commit the crime. And obviously rationality happens all the time. To get back to little kids, it always struck me, and my wife and I have 2 kids, and now we have 2 grandkids, and so we've seen this happen, and it's sort of fun to even think about. As a parent, you want to teach your kids to be rational, but not at the expense of their hurting themselves or risking their lives. So, an example that I always think about, and I've been talking about for years, if you're standing at a street corner and there are cars going by and the light is against you, it's a red light, and the cars in the street are correctly driving because it's a green light, and your little child says, I want to go across the street. And you say, no, you can't. And she says, I want to go now. I see something across the street. And you say, well, we have to wait, until the light changes. I don't care about the light. I want to go now. And you say to the child, well, if you go now, you could get hurt. So that's a rational argument, right? There are cars driving in the street. It's not the law that you're citing. You're just making a rational point. You see these cars moving. You can't go out into the street. And the child then says, I don't care. I'm going anyway. Well, what any responsible, sane parent would do would say, I don't care whether you understand it or not. You're not going out into the street. So, but as children grow up, when they begin to accept that, and you can see the acceptance of rationality from on behalf of most people.
Can I add a point there? So this is just to lead in that thing about rationality and its limits as well here. What if the child is instead of saying I want to anyway, saying why can't I go across the road? Prove why I can't go across the street. Give me a reason why I can't go across the street. How do you know for sure I can't go across the street? And this is the beginning of our infinite regress in a way.
Yes, that's right. And again, the ultimate tipping point is, and this depends on the age and I guess intelligence, but it's, even people who are not too intelligent can, understand logic pretty early on in their lives. But the tipping point is, if you say to the child, well, the reason you can't go out into the street, you see those cars driving. If you go out into the street, they may not see you and they may hit you. And if the child says, I don't care, it's more important that I want to go out into the street now, that's not a rational argument. So that child is not yet capable of reason. And you're right, it is infinite regress in the sense that you go back and back and you try to be as logical as possible. But in the end, when someone gives you that argument, I want to go anyway, you have no choice but to do something that's rational in your realm, but it's not rational in your little child's realm.
Again, I might offer another one. I'm trying to channel Bartley here as he builds his story up. What if the child says to you, well, Bill, you make, or Granddad, you make irrational decisions all the time. Your commitment, as you said earlier, to rationalism is an irrational commitment. This is the U2, or the argument from hypocrisy in a way here. The idea that if you are willing to say at some point we have to stop these questions of why, and we have to say, well, we're just going to accept that rationality is true. Why can't I just accept that it's not true? Why can't I just accept, for example, in Bartley's earlier life, that there's a Protestant God, or there is some other myth in the world, or something else that you like about the world? Why is it okay for you to bring an end to rational argument and not me?
Well, that's a very good point. Let me tell you what my individual response is to that, which may not be the response that other people might have.
Mm-hmm.
I think, first of all, it's important to accept the fact that there could be differences of what the most rational thing to do is. So, for example, let's say on a given evening, I have some work that I have to get done, but I don't feel like doing that work. I feel like just going out, and having fun. And obviously, I'm not getting the work done at that moment. I have done that from time to time. And I'm sure everybody else in the world has done that. But I don't think that that's irrational, because for me, I would say, look, the best thing for me to do at this moment is to just relax and have fun and not do that work. I'm not going to do the best job that I can on that work. I'm going to have the fun first, whatever that might be, and then do the work. So it's somewhat arrogant to say, well, every single thing I've ever done in my life, I've had a rational reason for doing that thing. But more or less, I think that is the way I live my life. And I also tend to accept among adults and children above a certain age that they also know what's best for them. And by the way, let me just throw something else in here,
Mm-hmm.
as long as we're talking. I think the voting age should be lowered in countries like the United States and England and Australia and South Korea and any democracy. I think they should be lowered to, I don't know, 14, 13, 12 years of age. Because again, I think human beings of that age have complete rational powers. And probably even 8-year-olds do, but you can't be sure. So that should be the only factor that counts in whether or not a person can vote. But that just show. I'm only mentioning that because, first of all, I think it's an important point to get across. But secondly, to show you how seriously I would take even what a 15-year-old, wants to do. If a 15-year-old says, rather than doing my homework, I want to go to a party and go crazy, that's not necessarily an irrational decision. It may make the adult parent feel better that, okay, I insisted that John or Jane stay home and do the homework, but that doesn't mean it was the most rational decision. Maybe Joan or John was in better touch with what they needed to do ultimately the best job on that assignment.
So rationality at its basis, then it has I'm not sure how you would phrase this, but it has, I suppose, a kind of, even if it has its own limitation and it has to, its original maxims need proof, and there's no proof for those original maxims, and it does run into this problem of starting from irrationality. It serves a kind of utilitarian function in a way. It means it shows the world that if we that we can move forward, that our problems can be settled in orderly fashion, regardless of the perhaps irrational beginnings. We don't need to rely on simply someone telling us what to do, or we don't have to worry about conflicting views hitting each other.
That's right, and it's good that there are conflicting views. And Popper's, get back to your earlier question and structure. Popper's very important contribution in critical rationalism was to shine the spotlight on the way scientists and philosophers and everyone just about were happy enough and even devoted to being rational, but up to a point. And beyond that point, for whatever reason, they suddenly began accepting authority as the more important principle than the rational analysis of whatever the issue was. And of course, religion, again, is the archetypical example of that. You can be a very rational person, but if something bad happens to you, something that, maybe you could have done better and avoided that thing happening, a classic religious response to that is, look, take it easy. It's God's will. And that's not a rational statement because there's no rational evidence that God exists. And okay, maybe it'll make you feel better. But a more rational response would be, well, no, it wasn't God's will. Okay, you made a mistake. Don't beat yourself up for it. But the rational approach is to try to think through, why did you make that mistake and how can I avoid doing that again? Rather than, there's a Yiddish expression, bashert, that my grandparents used to love saying. Anytime something went wrong, it's bashert, meaning it's fate, it's God's will. That it's comforting, but it's not a way of improving your existence. And as you know, what Popper did is he not only pointed that criticism at religion, but at science itself, for taking scientific discoveries too seriously. And this was, by the way, one of the things that immediately attracted me to Popper also. I ever since I was a kid, and I still think that now, I don't know if this ever occurs to you, you go to a doctor and the doctor prescribes some medication. And sometimes the doctor says, we have something really new for you here. This will really work well. Up until about 5 years ago, my colleagues were prescribing such and such, but they discovered that really doesn't work that well, or it has some ill effects. So I'm giving you this. And ever since I was a little kid, I remember I once said to my father when he took me to the doctor, I said, Dad, what are they going to say 5 years from now about this thing that the doctor's prescribing? And my father said, my father was a lawyer, by the way, so he had a good head for this. He said, no, you're right, but it's the best thing we can get now. But what Popper was trying to point out is science, including doctors, are not aware enough, as they should be, of the fallibility of what they think is pretty close to certain knowledge. And that was the revolutionary aspect and the very important aspect of Popper's whole philosophy.
Now that is as you're talking, that's fascinating. That's, I think, one of the things that Bartley focuses on here. So you're in the doctor's office and the doctor says medicine has changed, or we used to think this medicine worked and it doesn't. And there are some people out there whose response to that will be, then medicine doesn't work. And this comes back to, there's a wonderful quote that Bartley likes to use of Popper's, and he's talking about Russell. And Russell produces this paper showing the paradoxes in Frege's theories about arithmetic. And Frege says, and this is a quote, arithmetic has been set spinning. And Popper goes on to say, of course, Frege was making a mistake of conflating his theory of arithmetic with arithmetic itself. And this is one of the problems for rationality. We create theories of rationality, such as it's built on sense experiences, or it's built on intellectual intuition, or it's built on some other type of authority. And when those things break down or they don't work, we think rationality has broken down, as opposed to just the theories of rationality.
Yeah, well, that's a very, very good point. And one of the pitfalls of science and the practical applications of science, and for that matter, politics as well, and just about any human endeavor, is when rationality leads to the acceptance of a particular medication or a particular practice, we tend to think, okay, that's it. And we're initially hostile to things that contradict that. But yet, as Popper and, of course, Thomas Kuhn and other people have pointed out, that is indeed the very process of science. It's a continual revolution. This is, again, one of Agassi's main points. The revolution never stops. That's good. But a lot of people, including highly intelligent people, want the comfort of assuming that because rationality brought us here, we don't need to use it anymore. We're okay. We've landed here. This is working. This is good. And of course, the problem with that is, first of all, circumstances might change. Second of all, or maybe even first of all, the very process that brought us here might have been in error. We might have made a mistake in our logic. And for other reasons as well, this again is the essence of Popper's philosophy. Everything is in flux. Everything has to be open to criticism, which is what Popper was trying to say. And again, Bartley's point being, yes, but you have to be even more open to criticism than what you're saying.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far, and I apologize for this brief interruption, but I will take this moment to briefly send out a plug for the podcast itself. The Popperian Podcast is something that I've been planning for quite a while, and it's something that I want to keep running month to month. But to do so, it's going to need your help. If you're willing or able or interested, please go to the links below the podcast and support us however you can. It will be your help as listeners that keeps the podcast going and keeps the content coming out, and I thank you in advance. And with that said, we will now return to the second half of the interview. Thanks for listening. On that, let's get into Popper then, and then we'll jump straight to Bartley. Popper's solution to that, as you said, was it's criticism that matters. It's not that criticism is important for progress and development. It is progress and development. And this is why his demarcation matters so much and things like this. Again, something that Bartley will later disagree with. So I might get into that just a little bit more about how Popper changed the landscape in this, because at the time that Bartley was writing, he wrote somewhere that most philosophers, at least during his time, were critical rationalists of a kind. Perhaps even if they weren't Popperians, they had moved away from this rationalist tradition of the past.
Yeah, well, let me just say a great example that I always, to this very day, mention to my students, and I haven't bothered to research it, so I can't tell you the exact year, but it would have been like the late 1970s, early 1980s, when I was first becoming really fully acquainted with Popper and immersed in his work. And in those days, I was subscribing to Science magazine. Here in the United States, Science magazine is like the leading magazine of science, not Scientific American, it's just called Science. Over in England, there's a publication called Nature, and those are pretty much, in the English language, the two main organs of popular science publications that are available. And I remember I one day picked up a copy of Science, whatever the latest copy was. And there was a letter from a scientist who basically, it became clear to me, he had as long as like 6 or 7 months earlier, had an article published in Science. And in this letter that I was reading, the author of the article said, when I first read the letters that were published in Science in response to my article, almost all of the letters were giving me an enormous amount of praise. They thought my article was really important. They thought I had delved into things that they hadn't seen before. And it really made me feel good about my work. And, I was walking around, all aglow about this. And then I came across a letter that pointed out some really serious problems with my article and the research it described. And the most recent letter said, when I read that earlier letter, this critical letter, I was furious at first. And, I was saying, why did Science publish this letter? I get like 10 letters saying how wonderful my work is. This one letter basically takes my work apart. And a couple of days went by and the scientist was stewing about this. And he said, one morning I woke up and I began thinking, well, why did that person say that about my article? And I realized that, first of all, I could have expressed certain things more clearly than I had. And I also realized that even in the research I conducted, I could have done this a little better than the way I did it to get a more clear response. And in this letter that I was now reading by this scientist, the scientist said, I soon came to realize that amongst all those praiseworthy letters, the letter that I really only learned anything from was the letter that criticized my article. And that's the essence of Popper's point about criticism. And that's why I mean criticism, for Popper, it was the lifeblood. As you point out, it's not something that needed to be done any more than oxygen is something that needed to be done for life. It is essential for science and the growth of knowledge. And the reason for that, obviously, is it almost sounds trite to say it, but it's still a very important and I think commanding point. You can see white swan after white swan after white swan. You haven't learned a single thing more. What's the difference between 1,000,000 white swans and 1,000,001 white swans? No difference at all in terms of what you're learning, really. But as soon as you see a purple swan, finally you've learned something. So, falsification, which is one of the results of criticism, is indeed the way and the only way, other than just pure luck and happenstance, that knowledge can grow. So this is what Popper's life's work was really all about. Beginning with logic to Forschung, moving into conjectures and refutations, moving into objective knowledge, and, the rest of the work that Popper did. They all, in one way or another, were making this essential point. And Bartley is completely right. If you asked a philosopher or a scientist in the 1950s and 60s, are you someone who doesn't care about criticism? Why? Because you think you were born with innate knowledge and that knowledge has to be right? No one would have said, yeah, that's right. Everyone believed that they were open to criticism, but in reality, they were only open to criticism of things that they were willing to see criticized. And they all had sacred cows that they were not going to let happen, go beyond that. I mean, I'll give you just one current example, which is a raging problem here in the United States right now, and indeed all over the world. I have long been, and I still am for the most part, an absolutist regarding freedom of expression. And to bring this, importance of criticism, to play here, and even pancritical rationalism, so much so that I rejected, and I know you did a podcast on this, Popper's paradox of tolerance, because I think that if you censor what a Nazi is saying, and I understand completely, and Popper having in effect lived through that, I understand completely why he said that. But what you are doing, in my view, is in effect adopting a Nazi viewpoint, preventing any kind of speech, however hateful, to do that. So I still believe that. But the reason why I'm mentioning it, that's I believe that, and I think I know I can rationally defend it. But I'm beginning to think, am I really thoroughly being open to criticism when I feel so devoted to that point of view? And when you see all the hate speech that's going on now in the United States, and for that matter, the world, it's something that bothers me and it's causing me to think about. So that's why I'm saying I don't think I'm any more immune than anybody else to having sacred cows, that although I trumpet how important being open to criticism is, I think I'm open to criticism on that, but I'm so devoted to freedom of speech that I've publicly rejected Popper's paradox of tolerance.
So that's really fascinating, an interesting way we can get into Bartley a bit here. That paradox that you're mentioning there, you want so much criticism in the world because it is of such value. And there's a paradox of a kind that if you allow criticism of everything, including criticism of the methodology of criticism, then what happens if we prove the methodology of criticism false through that criticism, then we get rid of criticism. And that is that's the core paradox here that Bartley is getting into. And he's saying we don't need to, for one, I believe he's saying that's not really a problem, actually. It's not going to play out that way. But more importantly, we don't need to be scared of that paradox. He says we can embrace it. We can get into this. And people in Popper's tradition say we should accept as a presupposition that criticism has to happen, because without criticism, we can't make any more progress in a way. And people I think Agassiz is on Popper's side in this. At one point, I've got a quote here. He says, what is the charge? That we are dogmatically rationalists. He says, then what is the dogma? Then it's not too unpleasant. So it is a fascinating debate, and it runs around into that paradox of what are the limits of rationality and criticism? And Bartley doesn't think there are any limits to rationality and criticism. And Popper thinks there should at least be one.
Yes, and that's why, to get back before to the way I put it, I don't think we should be afraid for criticism to be subject to criticism, and therefore keep open the possibility that maybe we can't criticize something. There's no point in being afraid of it. But I do think, and I don't know, and again, I never really, unfortunately, had this conversation with Bartley because we were dealing with so many other things. And again, Bartley wasn't that comfortable talking, at least to me, about that. But I think a slightly better way of putting it, and I never had the conversation with Popper either, would be to just acknowledge that there is no way to rationally explain what's going on and in this very debate without accepting the fact that rationality is a valuable process. And once we do that, that is a kind of infinite regress. And, but ultimately it's unavoidable. And that's okay, because again, this is maybe a jump way too far. We don't know, if you think about it, how the universe existence emerged. And, the Big Bang is just basically a nice way of describing that. And, because what existed before the Big Bang? And once you get into that discussion, you're in an infinite regress. Well, something existed before the Big Bang. Okay, well, how did that something come into existence, et cetera, et cetera? So I think whenever we consider any of these things in their ultimate depth, we run into this problem, and it doesn't go away. And it's really something that ultimately what separates, I think, the valuable from the not that valuable ways of dealing with this is you have to acknowledge the problem. You can call it whatever you want. You shouldn't be hostile to other people who acknowledge the problem in other ways. And there's no way that I know of getting beyond this problem.
Bartley called this a crisis of integrity. I think this is his two phrases. He said, when we're younger, we choose an identity for ourselves. And once we've done that, the crisis of integrity comes around, where we have to, and we struggle to live up to that identity. And he was thinking back to his own Protestant religious traditions and some of the twists and turns that happened there. And he was saying that there's a crisis of integrity now within rationalism and the rationalist community, where and the critical rationalist community, where they are failing to live up to their own identity by just not being willing to look at the question that the whole process might be wrong, even though Bartley's sure that it's not, but we could get into it in some ways. And so I wonder how much of Bartley's history in this do you think plays a role, and how much license he thinks and he doesn't want the critical rationalists to give to the religious tradition and the fightists out there who think we have to make a leap of faith.
Well, I think that is a very important part of understanding Bartley's thinking, because I think alone among all of Popper's leading students, Bartley came from such a religious background. He was the most concerned with identifying himself and what he was doing as different from that religious background. Other people, for example, including me, I didn't come from that kind of religious background. And I'm not talking about what, whether you're Protestant or Catholic or Jewish or Muslim. It's not, that's the flavor of the religion. I'm talking about what role any religion played in your life as you were growing up. And I think that Bartley was, tormented is too strong a word, but it's certainly a conflict that never left him. He had to constantly stop and think and define himself in terms of how he was in contrast to the way he was, and in turn the way he wanted to be. Yeah, and I will say this, and I don't know if this will win me any friends. But, to be totally honest with you, I think of all of Popper's students and acolytes, I learned the most from Bartley. And I found Bartley, therefore, to be the most valuable. I mean, he had an unbelievable mind. And, but the other people did well also. By the way, look, I don't know if you know about this, but as long as we're talking about Bartley, I have to tell you about the rift that Bartley and I had. And it was for...
oh, please, yeah, because I was about to at some point wind back to the big rift between Popper and Bartley and why also... Yeah, so please get into your rift, yeah.
All right, then we'll go back to Popper and Bartley, because it's related, actually. All right, so Bartley's Popperian Harvest, which was the essay that he contributed to In Pursuit of Truth, which in my opinion is the best essay in the book. Not that you have to rank things, but it was just such a brilliant essay. And I know that Bartley poured his heart and soul into it. And it also is just written in such a beautiful way. I mean, the anger, the sarcasm, Bartley doesn't spare anything in that essay.
Yeah.
Well, shortly after the book was published, I got a call from the president of the American publishing house. Humanities Press was its name. May still be in existence. And the person who ran it was an old gentleman by the name of Simon Silverman. If you had met him, and you've ever seen like any movies that talk about, the Hollywood movie moguls from the 1930s, and 40s, Cecil B. DeMille, the Goldwyn Mayers, the people who made all those movies. Simon Silverman was that, but in the academic publishing world. He took everything personally. So what he's calling me to tell me that in Bartley's essay, there is a page in which Bartley talks about a British philosopher by the name of N.M.L. Nathan, N-A-T-H-A-N, who, by the way, I think he retired from his original teaching job, but he's still associated, I think, with a university in Liverpool. In any case, Nathan, had written a critique of Popper, which in Bartley's view, and I agreed with Bartley completely, Nathan had misunderstood Popper's work, and in particular had misunderstood when Popper was saying certain things. It looked to Nathan like Popper was uncritically accepting those things, but he hadn't read deeply enough. So that would have been fine for Bartley to have said that. But in Bartley's defense of Popper, and part of this defense came from the fact that Bartley had this very serious rift with Popper. So part of what Bartley was doing in this essay was showing himself and the world how devoted he still was to working with and through and improving Popper's philosophy. So in this section, a couple of paragraphs in this article and In Pursuit of Truth, Bartley concludes that I think it was Cambridge University Press, which published either the book or the essay that Nathan had written. Bartley said, it's amazing to me that Cambridge University Press published this by NML Nathan, which so misunderstood Popper, it would be the equivalent of Cambridge University publishing a book about Albert Einstein, which attributed to Einstein a belief in the luminiferous ether. And so it was very colorful, great. I, read it and thought it was fine. Nobody said a word about it when it was published. But over in England, we had co-publishers for the book, Humanities Press in the United States, and in England, I guess most of the British Commonwealth, a company by the name of Harvester Press. They published it. Simon Silverman, president of Humanities Press, was calling me to tell me that he had just gotten off the phone with the president of Harvester Press, that NML Nathan had threatened to sue Harvester Press, and that they were going to get in touch with Humanities Press. They were going to sue both presses for libel, and William Bartley and me, because of this luminiferous ether. So my response to Silverman was, great. There's more publicity for the book. I to this very day, I have a keen sense of publicity. Great, sue us. The Times Literary Supplemental, write something about it. Who knows? This is great. We'll get on the BBC. So Silverman said, hey, well, look, you might think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a good thing. We can't afford the expense. And, what's going to happen, even if you don't care about what's happening here in the United States, Harvester Press is definitely withdrawing the book. They don't want to be sued. So I said, well, my advice to you, I said to Silverman, is hold firm. Harvester Press are a bunch of cowards. NML Nathan, what is he suing about? He made a point. Bartley's correct in his criticism of it. Bartley's entitled to use that analogy. It's not such a horrible thing to say anyway. He makes the point vividly. So Silverman is saying, look, all right, I'm surprised to hear you. You're a young scholar. I'm surprised you'd want to be involved in a suit like this. But let me think about this. I'll speak to my attorneys. I don't know if we want to get involved, in a suit. Anyway, so that was that conversation. I call Bartley up and I tell him, and Bartley asked, well, how do you feel about it? And I said, well, I feel, as I told Simon Silverman, let him sue us. It would be good publicity for the book. Bartley says to me, I'm glad to hear you say that. Well, unfortunately, about a week goes by, and I get a call from Simon Silverman, and he says to me, look, I've spoken with my lawyer, and by the way, the libel and slander laws are somewhat different in the United States than they are in England. And the American lawyer did tell Silverman that the suit is more likely to be successful. That is, a suit from Nathan against Harvester Press for that language in Pursuit of Truth than it would be here in the United States. But because the suit is coming up first in England, if that suit is successful, Silverman's lawyer advised him there's a good chance we could lose the suit here as well. So I said to Silverman, so what are you saying? Are you going to fold also? Silverman said, no, I'm not going to fold. Just listen to me. So I said, okay. And what Silverman proposed is we take the paragraph out of that book. And I said, how can you take a paragraph out of a book? It's printed up. He then proceeds to tell me about this process where it's called tipping in. You can, take out a page and put in a page, and it looks like 99% like nothing really happened to it. And the gist of it was he would take out just those offending words, the luminiferous ether, and that would remove the basis of Nathan's attack. And he said to me, I just want you to know, I'm very close to withdrawing the book anyway, because I'm not sure that Nathan is going to accept that. He may continue his lawsuit. But, I understand what you're saying. I don't like giving in to these kinds of things. So he said, could you talk to Bartley about that? So I said, okay. Anyway, to make this long story somewhat short, I talked to Bartley about it. Bartley was livid and said, no, I don't care. Let them withdraw the book. And, this is more important. And as I was talking to him, and after I finished the conversation with him, I began, this is, by the way, a good example of, is this rational or not? I don't know. I'm not the one to say. I began thinking, look, I have a responsibility here, not just as the editor of the book vis-a-vis Bartley, but every other person who has an essay in this book. And, the book had just come out. It was just beginning to be reviewed. And, I wasn't going to speak to, some of the other people, but there, as you have the book, there are a wide range of essays in the book. I was happy to get some people to come in and write things, even if they were not even part of philosophy. I had Isaac Asimov and Helmut Schmidt write photos for the book. I had Luis DeSalvo write an essay about Popper and literary criticism. But I was still thinking about it. And ultimately, to draw this to a close, I had a long talk with Silverman in which he was close to withdrawing the book, but he finally begrudgingly said, if you can agree to have this, these few words taken out of the book, I promise you I'll keep the book out there in circulation. And I agreed to do that. I told that to Bartley, and that was the last time Bartley and I ever talked. And I to this very day, I feel badly about it. And in a way, what I was doing there, and I still feel bad about that, is I was basically curtailing Bartley's criticism of Nathan, deserved criticism. I was curtailing it so the rest of Bartley's essay and every other essay could be out there. That was, the reasoning that I used, but it was reasoning that led to a curtailment of criticism on behalf of keeping other criticism alive. So that's an interesting quandary to be in right there. And ironically, that was something that was very significant in my relationship with Bartley.
So that is interesting, because at the start of that chapter, when Bartley is, the one in your book called The Popperian Harvest, he starts talking about Popper, and then he says how well he got on with Popper and how he used to be teased by the other students around him because they always fought with Popper and had these fallen outs, and Bartley never had one. He said for 7 years, it was, I think his phrase was, idyllic. And then he said, we did quarrel, and then we didn't speak for 12 years afterwards, not once. So I suspect in his character, it wasn't just Popper. Often these fallings out with Popper happen, and we think Popper's a difficult person. I'm assuming Bartley was a difficult person too, was he?
Well, it was a difficult person too. And let me just say about Popper, I had a somewhat falling out with Popper. In the book, I talk about very briefly about Popper's ideas dying in our stead, which is an important point, really, Popper's philosophy. In my preface, I talk about that, but I talk about how that's much better than nuclear war and bombs dropping, and I presented Popper with a copy of the book, and then later I heard, not through Bartley, but through the grapevine, that Popper was really furious that I use an example of nuclear war in a way which implied that Popper wasn't taking nuclear war seriously enough, because I was saying that isn't ideas in our stead better than Popper? He had given a speech at the United Nations at some point, Popper had, in which he had said ideas dying in our stead are a lot better than exchanging nuclear attacks. And Popper thought that I had taken that out of context. And so Popper didn't want to speak to me for a while after that. So this was like, I'm laughing here, but it actually was somewhat traumatic for everybody involved. Somehow dealing with Popper tended to result with people not speaking to each other for years afterwards. But yes, Bartley, the reason that Bartley and Popper got along so well in the first place, in contrast to all of Popper's other students, is, and again, this is not going to win me any friends, but Popper's other students, yes, they criticized Popper, but on grounds that when Bartley finally came around to criticize Popper were far less significant than Bartley's criticism. Bartley criticized the very heart of Popperian philosophy by saying that it wasn't honest with itself, by saying that it did tend to be too accepting of certain things. And that's why Popper got so angry. Popper could accept someone saying, well, you overlooked this, you overlooked that. By the way, evolution of ideas and knowledge. Let me just give you one other example. I mentioned evolutionary epistemology before, which I still think is very important. This biological basis. If you're not familiar with evolutionary epistemology, you should look into it. I think you'll find it very interesting. What it basically says is biological organisms learn from criticisms also. As they grow, the environment criticizes them. It shows them what works and doesn't work, often resulting in their death. And what survives, the survival of the fittest, are organisms and traits that have survived the criticism of the environment and have learned how to deal with it. So anyway, there was one of Popper's students, a fellow by the name of Larry Briskman, who was an American who went over to England, studied with Popper. Sadly, he's no longer with us. He was a devoted evolutionary epistemologist when I first met him. And in fact, we were sort of half planning a book on evolutionary epistemology and putting that together. And then from my perspective, one day he said, you know what? I realized I don't like evolutionary epistemology anymore. And he just sort of put that aside. So these sudden turns, based on sort of a feeling that what you thought was really important wasn't important, for whatever reason, was a characteristic of the Popperian fold.
Let's just dig into that argument again, because I think it's so interesting. Again, you said that massive falling out that they had. I didn't properly appreciate it either until reading through that particular article, and one other that Joseph Agassiz put out. And Joseph Agassiz talks about the dispute between Popper and Bartley, which of course he was friends with both men. And he starts saying that, of course, Bartley argued against Popper, saying that what we have to do is we shouldn't make any concessions. We shouldn't have any presuppositions. And he said Popper just couldn't see the point in this. And then he said Bartley pushes back and says, well, it is important. And apparently Popper said that was in his work anyway. It's just a rewording of it. Bartley was rewording things. And then I didn't realize how personal it got. At some point, Bartley called Popper a fideist, someone who makes a leap of faith, and he called him an authoritarian. And this has some implications, because a lot of Bartley's work was saying that a lot of modern philosophy still has this justificationist tone, which is an authoritarian tone lingering within it. So to call Popper that must have been something that he knew must have gone very much to the heart of the man and his philosophy.
Yeah, well, let me just say about Joseph Agassiz, I love him, and I know you interviewed him, and I've benefited greatly from knowing Agassiz as well. But he's a piece of work also.
Yes.
When it comes to these things. I mean, I'll give you an example. He said to me, when I invited him to write his essay that's In Pursuit of Truth, he said, well, look, just be warned, I'm going to write whatever I feel like. I hope that's okay with you. I said, yeah, of course it's okay with me. I don't expect you to write about something you don't feel like writing about. Yeah, So sure enough, I get the draft of his article in which he says, I've worked on this article, I'm finished with it. This is my first and final draft. And he proceeds in the article to say, I don't know I don't know why I'm even writing this. Who's going to read this? Somebody I don't know is going to pick this up and read it. I'll never even know what they think about it. To some extent, it's a waste of time, but okay, I'll write about it anyway. And Agassi wrote that thinking that I was going to get angry about that and didn't care because, again, he lived in this milieu of people getting angry and even furious. I actually thought and still do think that's a very charming way of writing. I like that sort of defiance, but it's fair to say that Agassi, in terms of his view of Popper versus Bartley, I wouldn't say that Agassi was thrilled about that, but Agassi had his own pretty serious problems with Popper, and Agassi actually was happy, not that he was happy to see any human suffering, but as far as Agassi was concerned, this was just something that, although again, you would think that Agassi wouldn't want something that ratified anything because that's a form of positivism. But nonetheless, Agassi was happy to some extent that this had happened. Not in a superficial sense, in the deeper sense that it showed him that what was going on between him, Agassi, and Popper was something that was almost inevitable when you had a serious relationship with Popper.
There's last few questions here, but at least one of them I have to bring in here. And one of the big changes that Bartley does bring through from his work is a change in the demarcation criteria. And that is, so Popper's is between science and non-science. And of course, Bartley wants to be a lot more critical than this. And he wants us to look and not hold anything beyond criticism. And Bartley says we should change this. The real demarcation criteria is between rational and irrational. And this opens up a space where there is always criticism and always conversation between multiple fields. We shouldn't cordon anything off. So bring in the arts, bring in art itself, bring in law and all these other things. And I know from reading Ian Jarvie that Bartley was hugely influential for himself and many other people by breaking down Popper's demarcation and adding this one.
Well, that's a very interesting question. And like everything else, my views, and I mentioned this earlier in a slightly different context, but, this is something that George Maynard Keynes said, one of his famous quotes, when George Maynard Keynes changed his view that government should not spend more than they have coming in. And then when he saw FDR, what he was doing in the Great Depression here in the United States, spending way more than the U.S. government had. But what that did is it helped bring us out of the Great Depression because that spending of money generated income as more people went back to work. And somebody asked Maynard Keynes, well, what's the matter with you? What did you change your mind about this? And Maynard Keynes looked at this criticizer and said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? I think that's a good thing. So, and this gets back to what I was saying about the paradox of tolerance before. Up until pretty recently, I agreed with Bartley's change of the demarcation. And that's why I was saying, the difference between rationality and irrationality, this really is something that fed my point. And one of the reasons I came up with it, that ultimately you cannot rationally explain rationality without calling upon a rational argument. And so that shows that the difference between rationality and irrationality can be bridged right there. So I think ultimately that is the most important thing. But I have to tell you that one of the things that's been very disturbing to me, and I think to many people in this COVID pandemic, is this incredible trashing of science. So much so that, here at, Fordham University, and I don't mind saying this on your podcast. Some people from Fordham might listen to this. There was a dispute amongst our faculty about whether vaccines and boosters should be required for everyone who comes on campus, including faculty. And there was some faculty who said no, they think it's wrong for the university. And there was one philosopher who's saying it violates very basic ethics. You can, John, Stuart Mill, you can swing your arm however far you want as long as you don't hit somebody else's nose. Well, you're injecting something into me that's worse than hitting someone's nose. But of course, that person who made that point misses the argument that, well, if you infect somebody else with COVID, you're doing far more than hitting that person's nose. You're in danger of killing that person. But I was stunned that a biologist, a person in the biology department at Fordham University, stood up and said he too wasn't in favor of this vaccine mandate. And he proceeded to criticize, the scientific evidence that shows that vaccines work. Now, obviously, I think it's good to criticize science, but this bothered me because one of the things that's come out in the pandemic and what to do about it has been this view that I don't care what science says. I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. And anytime I hear this, I have to go back to think about Popper's demarcation between science and non-science. Just citing evidence that isn't scientifically validated, or citing a feeling that you have, or citing what a group of people are doing, independent of science, or citing what is anecdotal evidence. Well, this guy had the vaccine and died anyway. This other person was not vaccinated at all. This person is out there on the dance floor having a great time every night, with COVID raging. So therefore, the vaccine, is not really necessary. That's not a scientific argument. That's an anecdotal, point. And I'm not saying that those people should be prevented from saying that, but I keep thinking every time I hear those things, those kinds of arguments, here in 2020, 2021, 2022, that the world would be better off if it paid a little more attention to the difference between science and non-science. Here in the United States, he's retiring. This guy, Anthony Fauci, has been around, I don't know, about 60 years. He started out in the AIDS epidemic, and he's not perfect like anybody else. He's made mistakes, but he's done a great job, did a great job night after night, getting, on the media, telling people what was happening from a scientific point of view. And the criticisms of him, there were some criticisms that were valid, that were scientific, that were rational and logic, but most of them were irrational and unscientific. And so all these years later, Bartley's insistence that the more primary distinction should be between rationality and irrationality, although I agree with that, it is more primary. We shouldn't push too much into the background the importance of the distinction between science and non-science.
So, how, after all these years, do you look at the dispute between Bartley and Popper? And you've given some hints there, but on what side do you come down on, and in what way? Because again, reading Agassiz, I might quote him here. He says something along the lines of, "I know that Bartley and I know that Bartley and Popper disagree, but on what they disagree, I'm not so sure." He thinks it's a bit of a language game here, but of course for Popper and Bartley, it was much, much more significant. So, should we, as critical rationalists, be open-minded about being open-minded?
Absolutely, we should be. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Bartley's critique of Popper was warranted. And, from what I know of Popper, I, mentioned that brief problem I had with Popper, but the problem that Popper had with other people, including Agassi. And look, it's a very interesting point that this great proponent of being open to criticism was not as open to criticism of his own ideas as he should have been. But look, this is a common characteristic in human nature. Being such a great advocate of the First Amendment, as I am, I often cite Thomas Jefferson here in the United States, who was also a great advocate of the First Amendment. And he was the one who insisted, along with his colleagues from Virginia, James Madison and James Monroe, that it be the First Amendment, not the Second or the Fifth Amendment. But it's often pointed out that Jefferson had slaves, and he knew slavery was wrong. And we know that he knew slavery was wrong because he freed the slaves in his will, on his deathbed. And a lot of people want to then say, well, don't pay attention, to Jefferson as a philosopher. What I say is, no, Jefferson, the human being, was flawed. You have to look at his philosophy independent of what he did in his life. He was not perfect. Nobody's perfect. And I would say the same about Popper and about Bartley. I would say, as far as Popper is concerned, you have to look at his philosophy as what the philosophy is saying and not be surprised by the fact that Popper was resistant. This very person who was such a champion of criticism, that Popper himself was resistant to criticism. And again, regarding my problem with Bartley, what I did was a form of censorship. It took out a few of Bartley's words, but I think that Bartley, had he not personally been involved with that, had it been somebody else, he might have been the person to even advise me to do that, because he wanted everybody else's words to be out there, which is the reason I did it. I didn't have an essay, I do have an essay in the book, but it's not such an important essay as certainly Bartley's essay and some of the other essays. But I think that, again, Bartley was reacting in a human way. He was so furious, that this person, Nathan, who was so wrong, that Bartley was not allowed to say exactly how wrong Bartley thought Nathan was. So I think that just as we have to recognize that that basically we all tend to accept things in a somewhat uncritical way, even though we're champions of criticism, we have to even go a little further than that and say what we are especially vulnerable to not accepting criticism about are the ideas that we have the most invested in. And I'm sure Popper would say, well, we shouldn't have any investment in our ideas. That's Popper's intellect. But I think Popper, the human being, like everyone else, had something invested in those ideas.
Very last question, I promise. And it's on Bartley's legacy and where he sits in all of this. Because if you look on the internet, there's very little out there about Bartley. I was searching for things to read about him. Of course, there are articles such as the one in your book and other articles that he has written, and a few that Jarvie and Agassi have written about him. But he's not a particularly popular philosopher. And I found that strange because, as you said earlier, every sentence he writes reads like a novelist. He's such a good writer. He's a phenomenal read. I've ordered all his books since I've read the first two in preparation for this podcast, and I wonder whether I wonder why you think he has failed to take off, because it seems to be that at least one of his arguments was that, actually I might quote him here, he says, if my argument is sound, irrationalists lose their most formidable weapon in their intellectual armory, the rational excuse for irrational commitment. So perhaps it's he has struggled. I'm not sure how you see this, but perhaps he struggled for significance or at least recognition, because his target, though targeted rationalists, he was really trying to take away the argument from the irrationalists. And many rationalists couldn't see that that was an important thing to do. So tell me if I'm wrong, of course, and how you see Bartley's legacy after these years, because he died very young.
Yeah, he did. Well, I've given an enormous amount of thought, and we haven't really talked about this also. I'm glad you're asking this question. I've given an enormous amount of thought to what I call fame, which almost sounds like a cheap word. But when you say that, Bartley isn't as known as he should be, that's because he didn't have as much fame as he deserved. And it's a fascinating issue, I think, and I may even someday write a book about fame. It's not a cheap thing at all, because if something is very worthy, you want it to have as much fame as possible. You want people to be attracted to it. And it works in very strange ways. I mentioned very briefly that I became interested in Marshall McLuhan's work. And, I've actually written a book about Marshall McLuhan, Digital McLuhan, back in 1999, 2000, when it was published. I wrote a short tract in 2015 called McLuhan in an Age of Social Media. But McLuhan hasn't needed me to keep his work alive. And he was enormously famous in the 1960s and 70s for reasons that somewhat befuddled him and got a lot of other people angry, because McLuhan also is a philosopher, even though he didn't like being called that. But he wrote in a deliberately aphoristic, poetic way that made it somewhat difficult to understand him unless you were willing, to give it, the time. I'll give you just one very quick example.
Please.
He liked distinguishing between what he called light on media versus light through media. And by light on, he meant the light bounces off something. Like we look at a photograph, it bounces off that. We look at a painting, it's light bouncing off the painting. We go to the movies. So again, this is the 1960s, and we sit there and there's light bouncing off the screen, hits us in the audience. And McLuhan contrasted that with, again, the 1960s, there are no personal computers, watching television where the light comes through the screen and it draws us in. And that's pretty much all he said about that. And people went crazy about that, saying, what is this man babbling about? What the hell does that have to do with anything? And I actually did some thinking and some work on it. And I realized, what happens when you're sitting in a house of worship that has stained glass windows, and you look at those windows, there's light shining through those windows? Is that an accident? Or did maybe people in the Middle Age understand that? Or what happens when you look up at the sky, you see a blue sky, there's sunlight behind that? Or even when you look at a starlit sky, why are those such profound experiences? So without spending too much time on that, I think there is a lot of rationality and even science in McLuhan's work, but he became famous for other reasons and received a lot of criticism because of that. So this is like a long introduction to your question. I think actually had Bartley lived longer, he would have become much more famous, precisely because his kind of writing, what he said about NML Nathan, what he said about anyone, his sarcasm, his sense of humor. I'll give you just another example without mentioning this person's name, but this is quintessential Bartley. At this conference, we invited people from all over the world, and there was somebody from Canada, not someone who you think. It's not a well-known person. Okay. Somebody from Canada who was thinking about coming to the conference, but wanted to make sure that, let's just call this person they, so I don't give away their gender, but they wanted to make sure that they were given an adequate chance to make their point. And so I got on the phone with this person and they told me, look, I want to come to the conference, but I don't want to make a fool out of myself. I want to be guaranteed at least 20 minutes to make my point. And I said to this person, well, look, we'll see. I don't know how, I'll give you some time. And the person said, get back to me. Shortly after that, Bartley called me about something else and we're talking about it. And I mentioned what this person said. And I quoted this person said, I don't want to make a fool of myself. And Bartley, with his arch sense of humor and with his perfect tone of voice, mentions the person's name. Well, that person makes a fool of himself, whatever they say, right? So it's like he just had this, perfect level of like sarcasm and biting humor, and I think that would have played beautifully in today's world. Could you imagine Bartley on Twitter right now? I mean, Bartley would have stood up to Elon Musk and taken him apart, or any place. Could you imagine Bartley on cable television, called in for an interview? Bartley would have done well with those things. So the main reason that Bartley isn't as well known and as well read as he should be is he didn't live long enough. And what he was in his 50s when he died? Would you say 55 or something?
55, yeah.
So look, Popper, God bless him, lived to into his 90s or something, right? Mm-hmm. And those 40 more years are a lot more time. And I'm no youngster myself, and I know in the past 20 years of my life, since I've been 55, I've done an enormous amount of work, and I've gotten much better known. I was pretty well known 20 years ago. That was 2000 and or 1998 or something. I was pretty well known then, but I'm much better known now. And I think it's a real tragedy that for all kinds of reasons that Bartley died so young. But that is, at least by my thinking, the reason that someone with this keen mind, this brilliant insight, this analytical ability, this ability to write like an angel, just so clearly and beautifully and provocatively, that's why he's not as well known as he should be. But you're doing this interview with me, you're younger than I am. So people are going to listen to this interview. And, I don't know if millions of people are going to listen to this interview, but some number of people are going to listen to it. Other people are talking about Bartley. I don't think he's going to be lost. This is something that, one of my main science fiction novels is called Unburning Alexandria. I'll just say a little bit about that because it's relevant to this. It's the sequel to the novel The Plot to Save Socrates, in which somebody from the future comes back and tries to convince Socrates to escape. This, by the way, sounds like I stole this from Ted's and whatever his name is, Excellent Adventure. I had the idea before that, but anyway, in Unburning Alexandria, the main thing is not to save Socrates; it's to stop the Library of Alexandria from being burned. And one of the reasons why this attracted me as a topic is nobody knows what unique books, what unique tracts that were in scroll form were incinerated in the fires that burned the Library of Alexandria. There are some reports that we only have as much as 2/3 of Aristotle's work because there were unique copies that were in the Library of Alexandria, unique in terms of they didn't exist in many other places, and those disappeared. So the situation of being so unique and so limited in what the rest of the world can know about you is something that has given me a lot of concern. And I've thought, not about me personally, but I've thought about what has been lost to our species due to something like the burning of the Library of Alexandria. It was actually burned more than once. And one of the things that I've realized, and I have written about this, is the internet, the web, and with all the things that are wrong with it, and with all the hate speech that we find on it, has given an immortality of sorts uh, that didn't exist beforehand, and has made a Library of Alexandria burning almost impossible. Yeah. Right? It would take the complete destruction of the world, pretty much, to just wipe out everything that's on the internet. So many people have so many little computer-like devices in so many parts of the world, and so for that reason, when I say, well, hey, this very interview and Bartley's limited amount of work in general, that now you're going to read and you're going to be talking about more. I think that it's just a question of time until enough of the philosophic world and the intellectual world in general catches up with Bartley.
We can only hope so. And I have to thank you, because it was largely through being recommended to speak to you that I found the work of Bartley. And I am completely captivated now as well. On that, this has been such a fascinating discussion, and we didn't get into so many of the small and important details. So perhaps we have to do that for another day and another time. Paul Levinson, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
I really enjoyed our conversation, Jed, and I'll be happy to talk to you any other time.